These are images of a crucial part of the United States history that took place in the center of the 20th century, the Korean War. At the time, much of Minnesota was rural communities, small towns, co-ops, and farms. When America declared its involvement in the war, thousands were drafted, including 2 local Minnesota veterans. These are their stories, a life-changing endeavor of having to leave the farm to serve their country in a land on the other side of the globe, South Korea. From 1950 to 1953, a proxy war lasted from the invasion of North Korean troops on South Korean soil. The U.S. stepped in June 1950 due to its pledge to oppose communism, joining the United Nations forces. This meant, like the Second World War, young men from all over the nation would be drafted for duty and sent overseas. Farm life in Minnesota was simple, but far from easy.
Down in the early 50s, my 2 older brothers got drafted, and I was basically left alone with my father. We milked a lot of cows, we farmed a half section of land, and there was a lot of work, and hard work in those days, and everything was basically physical.
You are not alone in this, and you are not alone in this.
It was only a matter of time before Harold and Richard were drafted and sent to other parts of the nation for basic training.
Harold was drafted in, I'm thinking like February of 1953. I wasn't told about it because I was in the hospital before our son was born, and they didn't tell me that he was going to leave on May 21st of 53 until after I had Nicholas on April 30th, 1953. So that was a big surprise for me. So Nicholas was 3 weeks old when Harold left for the Army. He got to Chicago for induction, and they seen that he had a wife and a young baby, or a little baby, and they said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, they drafted me, and I didn't try to not go. I just felt that it was my duty to go." And they said, "Would you like to go back home?" And he said, "No, I'm this far, and we have all the plans and went through all this, so I'm not going back home." So he stayed then until May, or the end of May, first part of June of 1955.
Rich was drafted in later years.
I've never really traveled anywhere and been anywhere. When I got drafted into the Army, my dad gave me $60, and that's the most money I ever seen at one time, and I was 21 years old, and I was rich.
And he was inducted in Chicago. He left from Worthington, Minnesota, Knowles County, Worthington, Minnesota, and went to Chicago first, and then on to Fort Lewis, Washington for his basic training.
Harold told his wife about how drafty the planes were from Chicago to Washington in the bivouac war games that trained him during the duration of 16 weeks.
And I took a train from Sioux Falls, South Dakota to Colorado for basic training. And through my basic training, I went to Georgia, to Fort Gordon, Georgia, and had 8 weeks of class and experience in communications. And that was my MOS, so that was my occupation service.
After training, both men were sent to South Korea.
He got over to Korea, I believe, maybe the middle of November. He went over on a ship, and I believe that it took 21 days. And at first he was on the battlefields, and then for some reason they gave him a position, or he went to Seoul, and he was with the 8th Army, and his title was clerk typist, and he did things for the officers that came into his building, errands that they needed to have done.
Yeah. Never forget, we walked through a building and we were given a number, and so many, whatever your number was, so many went to Germany, so many went to Iceland, so many went to Greenland. The numbers 87 through 96 were going to Korea, and my number was 92. And then we flew to California, and from California we flew to Tokyo, Japan, and from Tokyo, Japan to Korea. We didn't fly from Tokyo, Japan, we took a ship, and we landed at Incheon. And I remember it was pitch dark, there was no lights, and we went through this tent sort of thing, and as we walked we could grab a sandwich. And we got on trucks, and we didn't know what we were getting into. And we traveled quite a ways, and there's some things I cannot remember. Ended up in Seoul. But then we were put out on a mountain with a dugout. You may have seen some of the pictures. It was just a dugout into the mountain where radio communications were, where we would have, we were kind of would relay communications from one point to another. It was VHF, very high frequency, where it would go through the airways. It would bounce off the mountains and into different areas.
Harold and Richard experienced South Korea post-war, cities, villages, and countrysides bombed, ravaged, and covered in poverty.
Got light. All it seen was destruction. Everything was kind of blown to pieces. The trees and everything were just shrubs. The buildings were ruined. And it was great, great poverty, like I've never seen or ever experienced. And from there we got on a train. And if I remember correctly, it took us almost 3 days to go 100 miles. Conditions were terrible. Sanitary conditions were awful. And then we went down dirt roads and et cetera, and just passed through the mountains, through the hills, through villages. In fact, some of the guys had some chocolate, and they would throw it out the back of their truck. They threw it out of the truck on the dusty road, and there would be a dozen kids all want that piece of chocolate. It was an experience of a third world country where I've seen the hunger and the poverty, and that will never leave my mind.
In his service, Richard spent 9 out of 14.5 months living in a camp.
And then they put me on an outpost by the DMZ. That's a demilitarized zone. That's a mile in between North and South Korea where there's nothing. And their army and military forces were on the other side, and ours was on this side. And there would be some uproar, there'd be some scrimmages, I would call them, when someone tried to come across or sneak across from North Korea to South Korea, and et cetera, and then all hell would break loose. And so we would get online, and there'd be some firing, and there'd be some of this and some of that, but nothing ever occurred real serious, but we never knew if this was really a real thing, or if it was just somebody trying to come across, or if it was the North, the communists trying to come across. So we always had to be on alert. And that's the way I lived there, always on edge, always on alert. We slept with our rifles in our sleeping bags and stuff like that. And you were always, you were so touchy, you might say. And while I was there, the tour was 16 months, but they shortened the tour. So I was there about 14 months, I think, 14 and a half. I was in Korea, living in those conditions, in a tent, in a sleeping bag, living out of cans and such. And I remember that there was a Marine compound, we call them compounds there, a training group of Marines down there trying to train the South Koreans military. And once in a while, we weren't supposed to, but we would sneak down there. It was about 7 miles if you took a truck around to get to this compound. But if we snuck through the mountains and down the hills and through the valleys, about 1.5 miles. So we would sneak down on foot. And we got a meal, and we actually could take a shower.